Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Lindstrom. I hold the Ed Henry Professorship of Political Science and director of Eugene Mccarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. Really pleased to welcome you all tonight for this event, co-sponsored by the St. John's President's Office. President Jim Mullen, who's with us tonight. When President Mullen first approached me about inviting Doug Brinkley, I was instantaneously interested. I've long admired, his writing. Okay, help me out here, tech guy. Yeah. I've long admired his writing as well as his commentary for CNN and many other news outlets. When I heard about Brinkley's forthcoming book about the 1960s environmental era, I knew this would be a fabulous visit. And as we consider the historical context of the environmental policy and politics we'll hear about tonight, we should also consider the historical context of this land and this place. And so as such, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery, St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, staff, and the monasteries are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. As we begin to learn the history of these boarding schools and the larger colonial relationships still operating today, we're reminded of the environmental injustices as well as the environmental laws that will be discussed by Professor Brinkley tonight. Introducing Dr. Brinkley is St. John's President Jim Mullen. Jim, we greatly appreciate your leadership over this past year, and thank you for setting up this visit by Doug Brinkley. I now invite you to come up front here and introduce your pal, Doug Brinkley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt, and all of our gratitude to you and the McCarthy Fellows for the extraordinary work and your leadership to ensure the McCarthy Center remains a uniquely significant hub for engagement in politics and public policy. You are much cherished at St. John's and St. Ben's. It is a personal pleasure for me to join in welcoming one of our nation's great historians to St. John's. I've had the privilege of knowing Douglas Brinkley as a scholar and as a friend for a number of years, and I'm especially pleased that his wife, Anne, has also joined us this evening on this visit to St. John's. Doug Brinkley is an American treasure, a national treasure, a presidential scholar, an extraordinary teacher, a student of American culture, a prolific author, and yes, a devoted son of the liberal arts. His love of learning dates to his youth in Perrysburg, Ohio, where I believe both your parents were teachers. And his mother, an English teacher, inspired a passion for reading and for intellectual discovery that has continued to frame his life. That passion for learning extended through his undergraduate years at Ohio State, his doctoral studies at Georgetown, and his time as a student at Oxford. And it has continued to this day. As the Catherine Sainoff Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University, he stands as one of the most respected presidential historians in the United States. His power as a scholar is reflected in the books he has published. 7 have become New York Times bestsellers. From his first biography of Dean Acheson to his most recent work, Moonshot, the story of America's drive to place an astronaut on the moon in the 1960s. And we are honored that tonight he offers the first public lecture related to his forthcoming work, Silent Spring Revolution, John F. Kennedy, Rachel Carson, Lyndon Johnson, and the Great Environmental Awakening. Professor Brinkley embodies the liberal arts and represents the best of American higher education. The breadth of his mind, with interests ranging from politics to music to folk history and environmental policy, is simply extraordinary. And his generosity to his students reminds us that a great teacher can inspire young people to find their own passion for learning. And his scholarship has set him at the forefront of his generation of historians. And so, as I welcome this renowned scholar and teacher, it is a privilege for me to recognize his place and present him with the St. John's University Presidential Medallion, the highest award that the president of St. John's can give. I do so recognizing his extraordinary contributions to scholarship, his commitment to the liberal arts, and the difference he has made as teacher and mentor to generations of students. And I do so with gratitude for the example he sets for us all, for so well embodying the values of our university, and for reminding us that there is joy and there is fulfillment in the life of the mind and the pursuit of knowledge. Professor Brinkley. A little something for your attention.
What a nice surprise. How lovely. And hi. I've had an incredible time since being at St. John's, and I really want to thank my friend Jim, who were friends from Pennsylvania and North Carolina onward, for having me here. Matt, you've been an amazing host, and thank you for getting to, I believe, a new friendship that we have. You've been incredible. And I wanted to, my wife Ann here's with me, and also my two friends from where I grew up in Perrysburg, Ohio. Karen Duddy was her name, but it's Karen Cooper now, and she's here with her husband Ben, and it's Karen's birthday. So happy birthday, Karen. She's sitting right there, so wish her happy birthday later. I won't embarrass her with making us sing, because she would kill me. But anyway, Karen, how special for me to get to be here on your birthday. That's a rare treat. We lived right across the street from each other in Perrysburg, Ohio. I thought I'd begin, and I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes. We're going to open it up to Q&A, because it's always fun to hear from the students. But I'll begin when we were growing up in Perrysburg in 1968, when we would have been quite young. That was the year Eugene Mccarthy, you get clean with Gene. Eugene McCarthy shocked people by deciding to challenge the sitting president, Lyndon B. Johnson. And Eugene McCarthy, the senator from Minnesota, had the temerity, the courage, the conviction to go into the New Hampshire primary and as a Democratic senator and run against Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War and against the Vice President Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. That's temerity when you go after your own leader in your own party. And Vietnam had so divided the country in '68. And Gene McCarthy has gone on to become somebody that we study and learn. You can't write political history without Gene McCarthy's presidential run in '68. And other runs, those are less memorable, but it's an honor to be even associated with the Eugene McCarthy Center, and please give my regards to the McCarthy family if you can. So picking up in that '68 period, of course, Richard Nixon wins. We think of 1968 as the tumultuous year of revolution, right? I mean, all this happening. '68 begins with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. And, we're losing. Johnson had promised that that victory was just down the road. We're going to be winning Vietnam soon. And suddenly the Tet Offensive is North Vietnamese, North Viet Cong, sacking the American embassy, taking over airports in January of '68. The writing was on the wall. This Vietnam War was prolonged, and we weren't going to get out of it. I once wrote a book on Walter Cronkite famous CBS newsman who went on television and, Cronkite basically said, call it a victory and send home the troops. And LBJ dropped out of the race. And that shocked everybody. When Lyndon Johnson said, I'm not running, sitting president, not be like tomorrow if Biden went on TV and said, I'm not running for re-election. It's seismic. But of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in '68, followed by Bobby Kennedy, followed by the tumultuous convention in the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And all of this revolutionary ferment, and we get Richard Nixon out of all this. Eisenhower's two-term vice president. And the one thing that glued Americas together as Nixon got in were really two things. Going to the moon. You mentioned moonshot. Neil Armstrong walks on the moon in 1969, an Ohio guy, not that far from Perrysburg. But the other big thing is the environment. By 1969, when Richard Nixon, the Republican, is sworn in as president, there is a unanimous feeling that something must be done about the destruction of planet Earth. And Nixon, the Republican, is not that keen on all of these, what were seen as liberal environmental policies, but the American public was demanding it. And Nixon got hit. He's only president days. And out in California, you have the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969, when the Union oil platform leaks, and you were looking at dead birds and dead beach from that offshore spill. And at the same time, in the Santa Barbara spill, people start saying, Nixon, you must do something about the environment. And this is something that Matt writes about. You've got to do something. And lo and behold, the media started doing environment in 69. And by the summer of 69, Ohio, the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland caught fire. That was the 13th time that river caught fire. Time magazine did a bogus fake news story. They showed on the cover of the Cleveland River on fire, like just a tunnel of flame. What could be more heinous than a river on fire? And yet that photo came from 1952. But they pretended on the cover that it was actually happening at that moment. But suddenly everybody started taking stock of their dirty rivers, their poison rivers, how all the fish were dead in the Mississippi, that the Hudson River had been contaminated. The Ohio River was dead. Pick the big river. We start saying, what's happened to all of our rivers? The lakes, where Karen and I grew up in Ohio, we'd go to an amusement park at Cedar Point, and you couldn't swim in Lake Erie. People were worried about toxicity. Our river, the Maumee River, you couldn't go play in or you'd be poisoned. If you caught the bass, you're worried you're going to die. And if you ate it. And so there was this massive environmental degradation. And Nixon was a triangulator. Beyond Watergate, and I'm speaking to you on the 50th anniversary of Watergate, the June break-in, coming up 50 years of Watergate, happened in 1972. But beyond that, Nixon's most famous for the breakthrough with China in 72 when he went to go to see Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and walk on the wall. But Nixon, and so the word's triangulating. Here's this anti-communist Richard Nixon suddenly meeting with the Chinese. Well, he did that with the environment. Suddenly, Richard Nixon I'm Mr. Environment, not you liberals. And Nixon, the Republican president, put through some remarkable environmental measures generated mainly from the Democratic offices of Scoop Jackson, a senator from Washington State, and John Dingell, congressman from Michigan. But Nixon, on January 1st, 1970, creates what Matt's written about, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the game changer. That's the beginning, guys, of environmental impact statements, that you can't build a building or mess with anything anywhere unless you're getting what's the cost on the environment. NEPA has been modeled all over the world, and Nixon brought it to light, took credit for it, even though the Democrats did it, but so what? It got done. And then Nixon, reading the tea leaves, saw 1970 in his State of the Union address, called it the decade of the environment, the 1970s. And in quick fashion, Nixon has to engage in Earth Day. Have any of you ever participated in an Earth Day? The first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, Nixon is, what do I do? All these anti-war, Eugene Mccarthy, kids, liberals, they're all getting together on college campuses due to Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, and Nixon decides to play it in the middle. He lets his Interior Department, meaning Secretary of Interior Walter Hickel, participate in it. He lets 1,200 or something Interior Department employees participate in Earth Day. But Nixon, it's one of the saddest photos you'll ever see, spent his Earth Day planting a tree in a suit on the White House, making his wife in high heels do all the shovel work. Well, they just dropped a tree, and that way, who's going to argue if he planted a single tree? He's like playing it both ways. But Nixon will go on later that year and create the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. I got to know well the first head of the EPA. Born in 1970, it gets, by December 70, it's an operation. They open regional offices around the country too. And that was a man named William Ruckelshaus. I did the official oral history for Ruckelshaus for University of Washington and Washington State. I got to know him very, very well. And he told me that he went looking for, in documents that he had, when I wrote the founding document of the EPA, nature writing mixed with legal language, but a founding document is something that you all know, the EPA. And he did this work, paperwork, and had it, but it was so hurly-burly, he forgot what the boss thought of it. And lo and behold, he found his copy that he had it took him a while to do a hunt, and it said on the sides of these points, he would write basically BS on the margins of all this, meaning Nixon didn't believe in the EPA, he didn't believe in hyper-regulation. He signed the Clean Air Act because he had to with emissions in 1970. And by 1973, he creates the Endangered Species Act. And of course, he's gone from Watergate. But one of the most underappreciated environmental presidents is Richard Nixon. Why? Why would Nixon do all that? That you guys demanded it. The public demanded it. Just like young people today are talking about environmental justice and combating environmental racism and dealing with indigenous rights, an upswell of young people started saying, we're going to save the planet, and their voices were heard. And back then, it was bipartisan. Nobody voted against the Endangered Species Act. What you guys are having to do now is protect the heirlooms of the Nixon years. You have to protect NEPA, protect the EPA, protect Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act of 1972. That's a challenge because people are trying to do dismantling of a lot of that policy right now. I started with Nixon, but the book that I have now really begins in Silent Spring Revolution, is largely about the influence of Rachel Carson. How many of you know who Rachel Carson is? Mixed group. So I wanted to write it straight about her. I'm going to tell you about her very quickly. But I had to begin the book in 1945 because when we had FDR as president during World War II, when FDR filled out like you students do for occupation later in life on a form, application form, he would write tree farmer. He ran a Christmas tree farm, and his hobby was scientific forestry, FDR, really his vocation, and bird watching. He was an avid birder, and he saved all these places. There's a letter at the time of Pearl Harbor when FDR's president that a woman, Rosalie Edge, writes FDR and says that they're killing all the trumpeter swans, this beautiful bird up in Henry's Lake, Idaho. They're killing and slaughtering the army and mountain corps, are blasting artillery and disrupting the trumpeters' winter habitat. Well, we just paid $10 million to build a skeeve to train the 10th Mountain Army Division. And yes, this bird, the swan, was being disrupted by the boom, the bangs. Some of the soldiers would do target shooting at some of the trumpeters. And there's an incredible letter. Roosevelt finds wind of this, and he writes the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, I've looked into the fight between the Army. This is Pearl Harbor, 41. I'm looking into the fight between the Army and the trumpeter swans. I vote in favor of the trumpeters. The U.S. Army must de-nest. FDR, he shut down a new $10 million training facility because it was bothering an endangered species. That's FDR. And FDR died April 12, 1945 in Warm Springs, Georgia. He was trying to make the first plank in the United Nations Declaration about global conservation, that you had to have global air quality. What good did it do for Belgium to have one law when France has another, when the air is blowing over both countries? What good does it do for Canada and the United States to, have different policies of protecting the Great Lakes? If Canada dumps garbage in it, we're going to inherit it. So FDR believed in that. Harry Truman did not. Truman came in and was in the pocket of the U.S. Steel, the huge corporations. We had just won the war, and we had won the war by industrial mobilization, and that all of these new chemicals and petroleum-based products and plastics were exploding, and we needed to get back to business. And Truman would say, I have no interest in any of these nature preservation kookiness of the Roosevelts. Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt did so much. If you guys grab a grid, a map of America, and look at national forests, monuments, wildlife refuges, these are Roosevelt-inspired. Truman went on the side with heavy industry. He even, as wrote Truman, says, why do we need to save ancient petroglyphs and antiquities of native peoples? I only see extraction dollars. So it was a fallow period in the 1950s on environment. But to add injury to insult, we were blowing up atomic weapons like crazy in the Nevada desert. Just blowing them up willy-nilly with nuclear and atomic fallout, making people sick. And it became, in the 50s, while Eisenhower's president, an environmental movement that's being hatched. It was called, there were all these strands. The word we use now, guys, for this period, 45 to 65, are proto-environmentalist. They're before today's environmentalists, before your generation. They just had an inclination of how we were damaging and ravaging the landscape. Different characters emerge in my books. Barry Commoner, one. And what unifies the proto-environmentalists in the 50s between Barry Commoner and Rachel Carson are DDT and pesticides. Chemicals of all kinds that are just being sprayed. Everywhere we're sitting here, the agriculture fields would have been sprayed with them. And nuclear fallout. The story in the 50s is the marriage of the anti-nukes people along with the anti-DDT people, along with a wilderness lobby that wants wilderness that's not being exploited, or like the Boundary Waters, protect it, don't use it as an extraction site or a place we need these solitude pockets. That lobby came in. All these nonprofit groups kind of come together, and they joined forces with two people, John F. Kennedy and Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson's born in Pennsylvania, went to Chatham, women's school, went on and loved writing, literature, Rachel Carson, and she loved biology and zoology. She went and got to study at Johns Hopkins. She would go to Woods Hole. Any of you guys know about Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute? It's where in Massachusetts on Cape Cod, just down the road from where John F. Kennedy was from. A bike ride. You could ride a bike between Woods Hole and the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. And John F. Kennedy's mother's hero was Henry David Thoreau, and his mother's hero was Rachel Carson. And they would read, the Kennedys were all about Rachel Carson because in the 40s and 50s, she wrote 3 books about the ocean. My favorite's The Edge of the Sea, but gorgeous writing about the ocean's environment. Beautiful. Nobody still has written with the passion and beauty of Rachel Carson on our tides, on sea urchins. Her main place was the rock-ribbed coast of Maine, but she spent time all up and down, particularly the Atlantic seaboard. And her books became mega bestsellers. At the same time, Jacques Cousteau, the great oceanographer, was having hot stories about his books and movies of the ocean. And Rachel Carson, when I'm saying hit books, I mean #1 bestsellers on the ocean in the 1950s. And Jack Kennedy loves the ocean. John F. Kennedy was a playboy senator, meaning he did not do a lot of heavy legislative lifting. Eugene McCarthy was a little like that and not doing the heavy legislative lifting that you sometimes like Scoop Jackson would have to do or an LBJ would do. But Kennedy had a deep passion for Cape Cod. John F. Kennedy's idea of wilderness was a cigar and seagulls overhead and yachting. But he loved the ocean, Kennedy. He was a sailor at Harvard. He spent as much time as his water as possible. Some people say that some of us have what they call blue mind. Maybe some of you do. And blue mind is when you need water feature to feel relief and a sense of self. That's why when I got here, I'm staying at the Abbey here on campus, and I look out the lake and I feel good. There's a whole theory about blue mind about that you might want to look into. Kennedy had that. And Carson's writing about the sea. And a man named William O. Douglas of the Supreme Court, if I gave one homework assignment tonight to the students, look up who William O. Douglas was. Douglas was from Yakima, Washington. He ended up going hitchhiking and hoboing, made it to New York City to law school, ended up being the Sterling professor at law, and is the greatest friend wilderness, the outdoor environments ever had. William O. Douglas said late in his life that trees have standing, that we should be able to sue to protect a tree or a species. If your second home gets destroyed by a company spill, then you can sue the company to repay your original house bill before the environmental disaster unfurled. Douglas championed Rachel Carson and was like a surrogate uncle to Jack and Bobby Kennedy. And he's in the Supreme Court. And when John F. Kennedy runs for president in 1960 and wins, he pushes through the Cape Cod National Seashore. It's a big deal, guys. It saved all of the dunes of Cape Cod. Cape Cod is expensive East Coast real estate. It's not like TR was saving the Yukon Delta in Alaska. This is right in the heart of things, Cape Cod. And to create a national park, national seashore there. And then he replicated it with Padre Island on the Gulf of Mexico. And then Kennedy did it with Point Reyes. And Kennedy picked the #1 person, if you have to rank secretaries of Interior, Stuart Udall was the best. He's from Arizona. He had integrated on race and was a civil rights proponent when he was a college student. He went on, Udall, and our national parks and our interior, et cetera, it's called the Stuart Udall Building today. Barack Obama dedicated it as that. Kennedy and Udall come in, and they start doing all this stuff, beautification of America. We call it a third wave of conservation. First wave was Theodore Roosevelt. Second wave's FDR era. Third progressive wave is Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon, that period. 60 to 73, the long 60s. And lo and behold, he's president. And in 1962, Rachel Carson, suffering from cancer, living in Silver Spring, Maryland, summering in Maine, is writing a book called Silent Spring. And in the spring, they had the big White House conference on conservation in the spring of '62. And then the New Yorker magazine started serializing Rachel Carson. And in Carson's research, she had worked for a while for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and she got information about DDT. Do you guys know what DDT is? The chemical sprays, and that we would douse our soldiers in World War II with DDT, but now we felt it was hazardous. Silent Spring comes out, and the lid's blown off. Because pre-1962, if any of you in the room were environmentally interested, the big deal was preservation of places like the Roosevelts. And meaning, we're going to create a national park, or we call it monumentalism, saving monumental splendor, gorgeous landscapes, which might bring tourism in. By '62, Rachel Carson is the environmental hero because she's saying, your kid's getting sick playing in their backyard. Environmentalism isn't just about saving the boundary waters. That's great. There's people that should be doing that. But your kids are getting sick from poison chemicals because America went chemical mad. We put it in everything without proper regulation. And it became a brouhaha. And because she never married, she was called a spinster who never had biological kids. What does she know about raising kids? She was insulted by every trope for women you can imagine. They tried to destroy her science. And John F. Kennedy, to his everlasting credit, at a famous press conference said, I'm looking in, we're reading Rachel Carson's work, Ms. Carson's work, and we're going to come up with we're going to have the scientists look at it. Well, the scientists came back and they said her research held up, that we're all getting sick from these chemicals. And at the same time, Barry Commoner was coming up, and others, I'm just naming two names for limited mic time, but are getting sick from nuclear fallout. And that combo there, Kennedy, Rachel Carson, '62, nuclear fallout and contamination of chemicals, the movement to ban DDT and to look at others, just burst on the scene. You can do environmental history pre-Rachel Carson, post-Rachel Carson. But as you all know, Kennedy is shot in Dallas. And as you all know, or probably know, or some of you do, Rachel Carson dies in 1964 of cancer. So there's kind of a void, and people are looking for leadership roles. But they had done such a job. Kennedy's greatest accomplishment as president, in my opinion, and I've written a lot about him, including Going to the Moon, was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. Where John F. Kennedy forced a negotiation that nobody can test atmospheric nuclear weapons, no underwater testing. Unfortunately, they couldn't get underground done. But he got Russia to stop testing, Britain. So we live in a world without nuclear fallout. Imagine if nuclear weapons were allowed to be detonated going on in Ukraine right now. Just imagine what our planet would be like if we continued blowing up, testing nuclear weapons in Alaska or in the Pacific islands, or the contamination of our planet would be so immense. So Kennedy deserves huge environmental credit for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. But in comes Lyndon Johnson, and nobody knows what LBJ will do. And LBJ decides that I'm going to make conservation, he called it new conservation, a big deal. And in the Johnson years of late 63, we get the first Clean Air Act of 63 in December. And in 64, with the Great Society, 65, 66, 67, and 68, Lyndon Johnson does all sorts of things we don't appreciate. First off, his first lady, Lady Bird Johnson, was the great beautification first lady who did tree plantings and consciousness awareness of having a greener, cleaner America. She's remarkable. Books written about her conservation in her own right. But we did things like the Air Quality Act of 1965. We did waste disposal. We were dumping raw sewage into all the rivers and contaminating places like the Maumee, but all of them, cities didn't have sewage treatment plants. Ruckelshaus, when he became head of EPA, had to tell Atlanta, Cleveland, and Detroit, get sewage treatment. You can't keep dumping this stuff in the lakes and rivers, guys. And Lyndon Johnson helps the environmental movement. Tragedy, the same time he's bombing Vietnam while we're burning and using chemical Agent Orange to to kill all the greenery. Well, here's one person doing all this good environmental work as president, at the same time running something like the Vietnam War. But in a generous spirit, which I'm not sure Eugene McCarthy would have for LBJ, but I would, he did other things, guys. One that, LBJ pushed through wild and scenic rivers. You have a designation that we own rivers that are kept wild, undammed, unmauled by hyper-industrialization. Lyndon Johnson created the national trail systems. We can walk the Appalachian Trail from Maine, down to Georgia, or we can go the Pacific Coast Trail, and also trails of studying indigenous people heritage at that point in time. He created Redwood National Park and North Cascades National Park and Canyonlands in Utah. And we created in the Great Lakes, it's Kennedy and Johnson and Udall and in Europe that are pushing forward saving of the Great Lakes on places like the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin National Lake Shore, Sleeping Bear Dunes in Michigan, Picture Rock in Michigan, Indiana Dunes in Indiana. I can go on. But they focused on saying the Great Lakes are a heritage site that we have to save and protect. Minnesota had two fighting senators, in Hubert Humphrey, who first proposed the Wilderness Act in the 50s. Does anybody here know what the Wilderness Act is? Lyndon Johnson signed it into law in 1964. Humphrey introduced it. It's putting hunks of American land where no roads are going to be built. Because roads create the destruction of an ecosystem. As soon as you build a road through an ecosystem or pipeline, now you're going to have a road for the pipeline, and you're essentially industrializing a natural site. So the Wilderness Act of 64 said no roads. And one of the inaugural ones for LBJ, October 3rd, 1964, was the Boundary Waters of Minnesota, which is a heritage gift to Minnesotans and all Americans. And there are a lot of great people like Sig Olson and others from Minnesota fought for that. I'll end by telling you that the Johnson years is the window into what we call environmental justice today. Why? Because the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, voting rights, working for civil rights, it led directly into an empowerment of African American community. The Black Caucus of today in Congress, created by 1971. And it becomes we're looking at neighborhoods in America that poor neighborhoods have been dumped all the industrial debris and toxic waste. And in my book, I write about the saving of Houston, saving of Anniston, Alabama, Fort Myers, Florida, many other toxic hotspots that we were abusing. But the heroes on the environmental justice side of my book are Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King famously said, quote, like this and many others, what good does it do to integrate a lunch counter, like from Greensboro and other, if you're drinking milk that has strontium-90 in it? So just don't think of King as just being about race. He's saying, yeah, of course, I'm leading the protest on race, but also I'm also a human. And what good does it do for me to have voting rights if I'm drinking poison milk that's going to make my kids sick? Coretta Scott King, his wife, one of the leading anti-nuclear testing activists in America. And two Latino leaders, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, out in California fields saying no to pesticides, that no to spiking in cancer, no to lack of sanitations for Latin America, for Latino and Americans. And Chavez is really the key link to your guys' environmental justice movement of today. He's the gateway when you started looking at the farm workers unions movements out in California in the 1960s. And so I'll end and open it up questions and just and simply say my last comment. If you're interested in environmental affairs, don't get to the point where you can't accept your people that came before you. I can tell you all the flaws of Lady Bird Johnson. I can tell you every flaw of David Brower of the Sierra Club of that era. I can tell you all the flaws of Eugene McCarthy. But they stood up and did something and spoke out, and they created this Silent Spring Revolution, which pretty much ends in 1973 with the oil crisis for energy. Just like now, you guys are having the high inflation, high gas crisis that started turning people off from the environmentalism, started simmering down a little bit. And so we look at it in history, this period of 60 to 73 as a third progressive movement of conservation. And it'll have other high moments, particularly when Jimmy Carter's president. But now you guys are living in the age of climate chaos, and this is all history. But I think when you study the grassroots activism, the bipartisanship of the 60s and 70s, with senators like or Congressman John Salyer, Republican from Pennsylvania, working with Democrat Frank Church from Idaho, on and on, the spirit of bipartisanism was alive there. Today, it seems to be a Democratic issue, environmental justice, climate change. In order to make big inroads, we're going to have to unite as Americans on the environment, and then we're going to have to be a global leader, which is tough with China and India and other countries that are polluting the planet so thoroughly. Thank you, guys.
I would like to start by thanking Dr. Brinkley for coming here today and for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. I know I can probably speak for most people here in saying that we could honestly listen to you speak for several hours, so I really appreciate you sharing what you have to say. I would like to start the Q&A off by saying that you are a known presidential historian and environmentalist, but what drove you to embark on sharing this story on exploring Miss Carson and her relationship with President Kennedy?
Rachel Carson, how can one do her justice in a few minutes? I just urge you guys to read Rachel Carson. She is an extraordinary figure, not because she's it's Women's Month and we're going to promote a woman. She's a giant. Her mind was such a fine-tuned tool, and she wrote with such grace and eloquence. And so I'd urge you to read her. She was able to keep a sense of wonder about nature. You know, I don't know how you guys process things, but there's a spirituality to nature. I mean, when you come here and walk or just look or be at the trees or looking at the seasons, Rachel Carson looked at things with empirical data and a scientist, but she also was a poetic soul. And she processed nature in a spiritual way. And that combo is pretty strong. And so I don't know, I would think she is considered one of the most important figures of the 20th century, and her legacy lives on a great deal. So the opportunity to write on somebody like Rachel Carson is exciting. But my people, my book, my characters in a big fat book are the people that I had to choose that made the biggest difference. I couldn't do every senator, so you have to pick a few. You can't do every grassroots activist, so you have to pick a few. Environmental degradation is in every city, in every river, in every lake, so you have to pick some as examples, and I tried to pick ones that had some geographical diversity in them.
Yeah, hi, Nick here. Thank you for your lecture today. It was very thorough and informative. One of my questions is looking at the grassroots movements from the 60s and learning from the Lyndon Johnson era and the Kennedy era, how could that be applied today to the environmental justice movement and trying to bridge a more unified America towards creating legislation that'll help respect marginalized communities when not dumping toxic industrial waste onto their communities?
Great question. Remember, guys, in 1970, EPA's born. Before that, there's not this sort of federal regulation of things. So we're dealing with the Wild West of just people dumping in the 60s. So you've all grown up beneficiaries of this generation. Now your generation has to teach us. We did too much, kind of what they call white patriarchal history. Too much of, these aristocratic elites who are, or politicians who end up wanting to save places because there's summer houses near them. All right, and there's some truth to that. But they were well read. John F. Kennedy read very thoroughly, and people like some of the senators I write about do. But for your generation, I would be a little kinder to the older generation. I don't know if you guys following John Muir of the Sierra Club, and Muir had a racist comment and comments about race at the turn of the century, early 20th century. They're heinous. And it has to be, we have to kind of really put a spotlight on Muir's writing. And it's hard to believe scholars didn't focus on that earlier. But we then don't want to discount all that Muir did with his writings to save the Sierras, so you just have to be measured a little bit on the past and then just go at it right now. Don't turn everybody. The problem if you go, I'm all for if you're going to go the radical route of environmentalism, but you don't want to burn every bridge around you and suddenly you're just a fringe group that's got no connectivity. And so I think with environmental justice, it's the number one issue in the country right now. How do we make places habitable? How do we make urban landscapes livable? Johnson tried to address it and did a lot. The problem is we haven't done the work we should have done in the 21st century. We haven't had it. We have an Al Gore talking about this, but now it's got to come right out of the streets with anger and demands. And so I cannot be a bigger fan of the environmental justice movement of today and what the younger generation's doing. And just when Matt was talking about how this school is trying to rectify a past, do it. We have to kind of be honest about what happened in the past. And it's not just about feeling superior about a previous generation. You don't want to fall into the trap of presentism. Everybody before me was stupid and racist, but not us. Because the next generation after you is going to say whatever you're doing now was stupid and racist. Because how do you ever get an equal playing field after all the abuses to indigenous people, African American women? And it's not going to be done in a day. At a dinner here, I was introduced by something I just wrote about Jack Kerouac, the novelist, about the book The Dharma Bums. But Kerouac used to say walking on water wasn't made in a day. Using poor neighborhoods as dump grounds has been going on since the founding of America. It's not going to get cured next week or next year. It's going to take long-term action. And also, if you really care about the environment, you got to get involved with politics because you have to have senators and congresspeople that represent environmental values. I was at a great event in Aspen Institute with Jimmy Carter, Ted Turner, all these who's who. And we're all having brie and wine talking about climate change, and nobody was going door to door for Mark Udall, who's part of the great Udall family, who was all about climate change, just a middle-aged white guy in a suit, but was really into the climate game. And nobody was like, the youth weren't campaigning for him. They wanted climate action coffee hour. when you have to go door to door. And that's one of the lessons of Eugene Mccarthy. And when he went into the anti-Vietnam War movement, they went door to door and got that. It is a political world. And so if you're going to deal with climate change, you're going to have, and if there's no bipartisanship, how are you going to get the votes to get all the big things done? Look what just happened to Biden's Build Back Better plan. Two senators it would have gotten done and would have made a big difference on the climate issue, but those 2 senators were missing. And so you can't ignore Washington politics and say, I'm in my 20s and I hate politics, and expect in a realistic way that you're going to be able to change things. That's the lesson of the 60s. The grassroots people worked with senators, congressmen.
Hi, I'm Will. Thank you for coming. I am a fellow history major, so American politics is kind of my forte. And in terms of what you were announcing so far within the actions presidents made to help the environment, what's one of the more significant ones that you could recall within recent memory that really set it back from any president? Doesn't matter what.
Well, I
period.
think when Ronald Reagan got elected in 1980, guys, when you do these things like I'm doing, I have limited time, and some of the stuff's a little bit complicated. So let me break it down as quickly as I can. But there was a document in 1971 called the Lewis Powell document. Powell ended up becoming a Supreme Court justice. He had been a head of the tobacco lobby. He was running a essay for the Chamber of Commerce. And Powell said, I guess I want you to realize is there was a reaction to all of this. It's called Trumpism. Part of what's going on right now with the 1960s and 70s environmental movement is by 73, the extraction industries, meaning the oil and gas world, they started saying, enough. How much? We're going to be regulated to death. We're losing jobs from mining. We're going to lose jobs for timber. We're going to lose jobs for rivers. We can't be, yes, pollution's bad. Nobody wants to see some dead birds in the Santa Barbara slug, dying on TV. But we're going to have to create a counter, because they were very afraid, corporate America writ large, of Ralph Nader, consumer activists, and they didn't know that pretty much ended a lot of this with the Endangered Species Act in 73. For all they knew, there were 5 more of these coming. And they thought it would become a socialist America. And so the capitalist order got their geared up and said, we're going to create a counter-revolution to stop this Silent Spring Revolution. And out of it was born the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, Cato Foundation, Fox News, right-wing radio. I could go on and on and on, because what really bothers the Trump movement is government regulation. They don't want, it's all about bottom dollar making money, and regulations stop me making money. I don't want the federal government telling me what to do. And in the 60s, under Johnson, Kennedy, and Nixon seen as a sellout to the conservative movement. Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon brought the government way into regulating things. So we're living in the counterswing now, and where people are trying to find we're not going to go maybe one in direction, but how do we find a solid middle ground right now? I probably lost a few of you by seeming to be an ardent environmentalist, because some people here have others. There are other issues in life. There might be a reason why you're a modern Republican, which is fine as long as you're voting and vote and believe what you want to believe. But it's a war now. When I go somewhere and say environmental, anybody on the right's like, it's like tree hugger, environmental guy. But if I go to Perrysburg, Ohio, and went to a town hall meeting and said, we need to clean the Maumee River so we can fish in it again, it's bipartisan. So our language, in some ways, we've got to see how we deal with it. I've just ignored it. I'm calling myself environmentalist, blah, blah, blah. But I'm just saying I do see that communicating is something where people are going to think about I was with a group of environmental journalists who were raising the question the other day, is it better to talk about stewardship? Can we say, well, this is about Minnesota stewardship over Minnesota environmentalism? And with that signal, we're about being good stewards of the land and the water, God's great earth. Is that a more potent way to go? Or do you just go, Green New Deal, you don't get it, you're a polluter. I'm not, those are questions that are worth asking. But most people I know in America that are good people, I think most people want clean air, clean water. I don't think anybody enjoys it except for a few pirates out there, which certainly exists. But by and large, I think you can win people over as long as you don't feel like you're saying I'm smarter than they are. Ronald Reagan used to say you can get away with anything in America if you look good on a horse. I think a better way of looking at it, you can get away with a lot in America if you don't condescend. A lot of people don't like condescending. And if the left or liberals seem condescending, I'm smarter than you. You're going to have a hard time winning constituency to your conservation environmental issue. George McGovern, the liberal senator from South Dakota, told me before he died, who was in these Senate votes, I wish we never lost the word conservation because conservatives thought it was close to conservatism. Like, I'm a conservationist, but I'm not an environmentalist. So these terms get hijacked is all I'm saying, guys. And we might want to think about how one in platforming, do you go scorched earth, planet's dying, scorched earth? Or do you say, how do I consensus build? And that's an age-old political issue. Anyone else? Yeah.
It isn't just about people, it's also about events that we don't see, and I'm sure you wrote about those, but why, for example, does East St. Louis, which was a Monsanto which is disaster, not get a lot of attention, but Love Canal did? And so different events at different times seeded different kinds of responses in terms of public policy and political response, even though they had similar roots. So how did you reconcile that?
What a great question. The gist of it is, once in a while the media goes to town on an issue, and they'll go nonstop on it, and then an equally bad issue will get no coverage. So he's asking, why did East St. Louis not get that environmental coverage with the Cuyahoga fire or Love Canal did? It's a problem. I think our media is broken. I don't believe, I think I've been at CNN for a long time, and it's very problematic when you're doing with things on climate. It's like Planet and but people say there are no ratings. People aren't watching it. Look at right now, it'll be Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine every minute, an hour, as it should. We really should be our lead. But there's also climate disaster unfolding on us and yet we can't. Where is it? It's not referred to much. We've been holding presidential debates when the environment's not placed. It sometimes falls back and it only gets resurrected if it's some visual that a powerful company, if the New York Times decides to make a story front page, it'll go. Otherwise, a lot of environmental disaster goes as local problems, localism. Katrina, where my wife Ann and I wrote a book called The Great Deluge, Katrina made it big. But there are other disasters that have gone on that don't get much coverage. So we're sort of, and there's sort of one groupthink media that like I know we all think there's this MSNBC Fox divide, but there's also kind of a groupthink about big stories. And it'd be nice to find that we, on issues of environmental justice, can start making the headline news. Carter's Love Canal and 3 Mile Island combined was a way to go after Carter, because the environmentalists felt betrayed by Carter. These things were happening. In truth, it's another talk, but Carter did Superfund, and Carter did Alaska Wilderness, and Carter did a lot of important things. But alas, Jimmy Carter, when he became president, put solar panels on the White House, right? Alternative. Ronald Reagan ripped them off. They got put on eBay, the solar panels. Some are in Japan and some are out of college in I think, Maine right now. That was supposed to be the big thing. Carter comes in, the solar future, and boom, they couldn't get the media coverage on getting that alternative revolution going. We'll have to see how the electric car tracks in the coming decade. And by the way, anybody needs to go for some personal reason, please don't feel they're insulting if we're going a little long here. Yeah. Thank you guys for coming.
Hi, my name is Addison Fraze. I'm an environmental studies major. You talked a lot about Johnson and how while he was doing all this environmental legislation, he was also doing all the things over in Vietnam. And so as a person really avid about the environment and today and impact as we move forward, how do you suggest or how do you see us balancing the difference between economics and military with environmentalism? Because I think as we move forward, there's these big ideas about, okay, we need to do the economics, which allowed the movement in the 70s to not be as successful as we moved into the 90s. But how do you suggest as we move forward that changes?
Great question. Look, guys, Vietnam was a multiple-tier tragedy that our country had to endure, and I'm not sure we've ever fully recovered from it. But there are a lot of times that we have to stop the U.S., the Department of Defense, from running kind of test bombing ranges, their dumping of toxic ships or Navy into the oceans. We've got so one could look at, it has to do an environmental study of DOD and keep them held accountable at Department of Defense for what they're doing. But I don't know, you guys are watching the Ukraine situation, and I see an environmental disaster in addition to the human rights disaster. I mean, oh my God. What they're doing environmentally to that once beautiful green region, it's sickening what's happening right now. And we were the bad guys in Vietnam. That's why Eugene McCarthy spoke out. And right now, it's obviously Russia's the bad guys. The whole world is turned them into a pariah. But there are people there that I know that have gotten arrested in Puerto Rico against the Navy doing bomb ranging testing on coral reefs. And, the oceans are a whole other issue. The oceans are in peril. There's so much work. I worry about young people on this topic of tonight, of overload. How in the world do you begin to do things? Sometimes localism is good. Meaning, what's the local river, local lake? What can you do on a local environmental issue that you can make a difference in? Or become a friends of the Boundary Waters or friends of Yellowstone, or be involved with, if you can't do it full time, how many of us can? And I'm driving I know I probably can financially afford to make the switch over to electric, but I haven't yet. So I'm not trying to be holier than thou. I have a plastic pen here, and I have a plastic Perrier bottle laying around here, It's hard. And I want to remind myself to start getting off personally some of my bad habits without having to beat myself, And most people right now are trying to pay grocery bills, and they're driving to work, and it's gasoline stations in America, and are they supposed to feel horrible about themselves? So I think that generally a lot of kindness. Rachel Carson's hero was a man named Dr. Albert Schweitzer, and he was in Gabon, French Equatorial Africa, and Dr. Schweitzer used to talk about a reverence for life. And he had an interesting philosophy, if any of you want to look at it. His reverence for life on these issues was, if I'm in my house and there is right in my kitchen and there's a cockroach, I'm going to kill it. But I don't want to be, every time I see something, I feel that need to kill. So if I'm walking and the cockroach is in a park somewhere minding its own business, I'm not going to put the killing energy into other species all the time. He would eat steak, but he wanted to make sure, he was hoping we could create a standard for our beef industry that would not be quite as heinous as it is right now. An more ethical way of doing farming and livestock with live creatures. So a lot of this becomes, I think, in the end, looking at oneself and developing a moral stature to these things too, and try to recognize we're all on this planet with other species trying to survive. We all, as Schweitzer would say, we all have that one element in common.
Yeah, we have time for one more question.
You mentioned Gene McCarthy and you mentioned Hubert Humphrey. I was wondering if you would be able to talk a little bit about Walter Mondale, because you mentioned the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and he was instrumental to that. And like you said, you can't talk about everybody, but since you're here.
Well, Walter Mondale is very important, particularly when he worked in collaboration with Gaylord Nelson, and they did things like the St. Croix National Riverway, and also the Croix, and so his work is incredible. Walter Mondale, environment. He's one of the great environmental senators. Look, when I'm dealing with different students here, well, there's no reason that everybody would know all these senators, but there were a handful that mattered. Mondale and Bobby Kennedy got into the environment, but the big ones beyond Mondale, Bobby Kennedy, Gaylord Nelson, Clinton Anderson from New Mexico, Scoop Jackson, we were talking today in Oregon, Newberg. There's a handful that really prioritized it. And what I was trying to say is, if you really care about the environment, who are your senators and legislators today that are prioritizing it in their offices? Markey is the senator from Massachusetts. So if that really matters to you, try to work for Markey's office. Look and see what Markey's do. There are some environmental senators. I've looked at what Barbara Boxer did in California, saving the desert, and it's remarkable. And incidentally, a lot of my book, as I started with Nixon, it was bipartisan. This is not a just Democrat, Republicans. Walt Disney was a big environmentalist before his time, not what would please the environmental justice community of today, but in the idea of bringing consciousness to species and survival. And so there are different oddball people that kind of plug in to make the thing work. But I would, first and foremost, I think Amy Klobuchar does a great job on environmental issues. They're out there in the Senate today, and I would gravitate to if that's what your passion is. Your passion might be finance reform or immigration, and they're all, though, in the end, every issue is interlinked to the environment, all of it. And I'll end by just telling you, every time E.O. Wilson, who just died, Harvard naturalist, would talk about his expertise were ants. And when he would fly, like you're landing into Minneapolis, he would see cities and see the patterns being like anthills. And he wrote very brilliantly about human behavior like ants. Sometimes we're too big for our own britches, humans. We want to dominate every river. We want to conquest everything. We want to own everything, that other animal species are beneath us, that we're the superior beings, that we're humans, and all of this. And sometimes it's important to self-humble and realize that that it's an entire planet that we're on. And by saying one of the big motivators, oddly, was going to the moon, because people started seeing waste of money, some people would say, and from an environmental justice perspective, it may have been. But from a psychological perspective, people saw photos of Earthrise and the Earth and said, my God, this fragile blue-green globe floating out there, no borders, that we're all alone in this solar system. And so instead of a moonshot, what the world needs now is an Earth shot. And the question is, how can we get there? The moonshot, going to the moon, and when I began this in '69, going to the moon, it was about the United States beating the Soviet Union. We're going to be first. We're going to put an American flag on the moon. My God, it became a football game. Communism versus democracy. Which side has better technology? But we could control our game in the U.S. because we were funding it. 4.4% of our annual budget went to NASA in the 60s. Today, it's a third of 1%. But we did the moonshot. The problem with the Earth shot, it's got to be global. So now your generation not only has to coalition build to get America off of fossil fuels, but you're going to then also have to have diplomatic foreign policy initiatives to reform China, India, etc. Heavy lifting, doing things globally. But for planetary existence, the hour is very, very late. But if everybody does one step at a time, we'll get somewhere. Just keep looking for things you can do, either locally or nationally. Give a little bit of your time to kind of planetary stewardship. And, I've been to all these climate summits. I've been to all of them. And the only one that humbled me on all these big climate, the biggest people, guys, honestly. And then I recently was at Pepperdine, and I saw a couple of college students sitting at a table, their green table at a fair. And I came up to them, nobody was standing there, and I said, what does your club do on campus? And they said, we get up and we go twice a week. We get up at the crack of dawn, and our group, our green club, goes down to the beach and picks up trash down and along the beach in Malibu. I found that refreshing. Like they're actually getting up, having fun, going on the beach, picking stuff up, and doing it, not just the laptop work, but actually getting out there and doing something physical and getting out in the outdoors and getting engaged. And so there are a lot of beautiful things that one can do. Just keep believing in how special this planet is and how we have to make sure we keep its waterways and air, forest, special and livable. And I'm afraid we're not doing well at that in the 21st century, not anywhere near as well as we need to if we're going to be able to live in a planet that is so endowed with so many special and remarkable gifts of natural resources. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to come here and to discuss this very important topic with us. I'd like to once again thank Professor Brinkley and his beautiful wife Anne for coming here and sharing in the beautiful Minnesota weather with us and for just sharing their wisdom and their knowledge. Professor Brinkley's book will be coming out in the next couple months. Otherwise, he has several other New York Times bestsellers that are out on the market already, and I would encourage you to go look at them. And thank you very much for coming, and travel home safely.